Ironically, I feel like the layperson on this panel because housing policy is not my area of specialty, neither as an academic nor as an activist. I feel I come here today as an ally and as a foot soldier who's trying to work with the leadership in Picture the Homeless, and I appreciate the leadership they've brought to this issue. Just to speak autobiographically for a moment, I came specifically to work with Picture the Homeless through one of their campaigns about 3 years ago or so now of developing an interfaith support network around the Potter's Field. It may be news to a lot of folks here, but New York City does have its own Potter's Field. That is a burial ground for low-income, indigent, and homeless New Yorkers. This is going back more than 100 years, where hundreds of thousands of people are buried on a small island off of City Island, itself off of the Bronx. And this is maintained by the Department of Corrections. You can't get out there except through the Department of Corrections. And Picture the Homeless leadership and members felt that it was important for people who are interred there to have the dignity and respect due to anyone who's passed away. In my own tradition, Judaism, that's held as a cardinal principle, the honor owed to the dead. So it was felt that for family members, for friends, that they should have access to that place to go and offer remembrances, to offer religious ceremonies for those who are religiously affiliated. So they brought in a very diverse network of religious leaders, Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other faith leaders to actively advocate to create these services and then to institutionalize them, to go out regularly to Hart's Island through the Department of Corrections, ferry, it's the only way to get out there, and to minister to the community of the homeless and their allies and those who passed away. I did it myself about 1.5 years ago, and I have to say it was one of the most profoundly transformative experiences I've had in the city, to be on an island that really is an island of the dead. There are no markers, there's no individual identification of names, but you're literally standing on ground that's hundreds of thousands of people have been buried on over some century or so. And to sort of feel yourself to be in the community of that history and the people now who are thinking about those people and trying to preserve their legacy in a meaningful way in fighting for social justice, I found tremendously profound. And if you have a way to join one of those religious delegations in the future, I would very much encourage you to do so. So that's how I come to this work. My own work is advocating with religious leaders around low-wage and immigrant worker rights. But as you can tell already, there's a great deal of overlap between that area of concern and the area of concern of the homeless and those who need access to affordable and decent housing in this city and in this country. So I was asked to specifically speak about the role that the religious community can play in what Professor Marcuse laid out as this grand coalition for justice. And I'd like to unpack that a little before I just jump right in. The notion of a religious community sounds very appealing. It sort of speaks of a unity and an idealism. For us progressives, we think immediately of Dr. King and Dorothy Day or perhaps William Sloane Coffin. I wish it was that simple. As social institutions, the religious community is as fractured and riven with class and racial and gender conflict as any other institution, I might argue perhaps more so. And it's hardly been the case that the religious community historically has been great champions of justice. Perhaps it's been more as an exception than the rule, I honestly would have to say. But that said, and I do want to say that although it's not the topic at hand, the religious community has missed the mark on a lot of issues. I would say perhaps most profoundly in its utter and abject failure to come to terms with human nature in the diversity and fluidity of human sexuality. When you miss the boat that profoundly, it's hard to then get on the boat, but we're trying. So just to review, I would still argue that the religious community as one constituency has been one of the most energetic and effective engines of social change in this country, perhaps in the last 100 or 150 years, along with, I would say, the other institution would be the labor movement. There are certainly others, but those are the two that I am most familiar with. So you can go back to the time of abolition, before the Civil War, where Quakers and Presbyterians were at the forefront of that struggle. In our own time, many of us, certainly the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement was born out of the crucible of the African American church and all of the spiritual power that unleashed. The anti-war movement, certain liberal mainline Protestants, radical Catholics, what we call the Catholic left, and others were at the forefront of that struggle, as they were in various other human rights struggle, the anti-apartheid movement. My own sphere, that of labor alliances with the religious community, goes back to the 1930s, which has been an on-again, off-again partnership that has been effective where it's been solid. So there is this inconsistent but still real record of religious community support for social justice struggles that I think is important to hold up, because we're now some 30 years into the ascendancy of the religious right. So it almost boggles the mind to think that the religious community could weigh in on the side of justice and progressive causes. We're that far away from the religious community as a whole taking that kind of stance. If anything, we think of it taking a rather reactionary stance. I already mentioned the whole issue of sexuality, abortion rights. That's what we're more used to when we think of public policy in the religious community. But that said, I do want to reclaim that piece of the history of the religious community's involvement in progressive social change. In our own times, contemporarily here in New York, I've certainly seen religious community engagement on issues about homelessness. There are a number of groups, including the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing, that have really brought the religious community in. On hunger, the group that was active for a while, Interfaith Voices Against Hunger. On immigration, we're now seeing the rise of a new sanctuary movement that's advocating for and standing with people threatened with deportation, breaking up families solely on the grounds of immigration status. On policing issues, religious leaders have really weighed in against police abuse and police brutality. On the broad issues of economic justice, worker rights, low-wage worker rights, there's an increasing involvement of religious leadership, because if nothing else, this affects their own flock. We're not talking about different communities here. There's an absolute identity of interests in many instances between religious communities on the front line of economic justice struggles and the homeless and the low wage. These are the people in the pews. They're not someone else out there. This is the same community we're talking about. So as a constituency, the religious community brings a lot to the table. First of all, it brings the human resources that it has, both in its leadership, but I would say more importantly, through the lay leadership, the people in the pews and the benches. And that's a huge network, or huge networks. Also, it brings, in some instances, fairly vast financial resources to the table. If you think about individual congregations like, I don't want to pick on them, but Trinity Church downtown is one of the wealthiest congregations in the world with something like $2 billion endowment. So we're not lacking in financial resources, either in individual congregations or certainly if you go to the level of denominations. Congregations in the religious community can wield that as an effective lever for social change. Their investments, their financial portfolio, they shouldn't shy away from that. That's an important part of what they can do as a community. But perhaps, and this is I think where we're a little more familiar to the role religious communities can play, is in the moral authority they can wield. And I mean this in a real sense. The whole issue of public morality has been so debased, again, by the religious right, I almost shy away from raising that. But I do think that there's a role for the kind of prophetic voice that we have heard resonate in this country, addressing issues like the war, addressing issues like poverty. We need that again. There's an absolute dearth of that kind of leadership, intellectual leadership, spiritual leadership, and the religious community can play that role. I would say it should play that role. And if it's to do so, it has to move. This is, I think, the most important challenge. It has to move from a model of charity to a model of advocacy and justice. And I'm not knocking charity. It's been absolutely essential that the religious communities have played the role they've played in providing direct social services to people who are vulnerable, to people who are marginalized and dispossessed, providing direct services, food, pantries,